This actually happened. I was sexually harassed in the 9th grade, and I was in a full class with students and a teacher present. This happened with 2 boys, both on separate occasions with each of the boys. And then a few days later, another incident took place within the same situation, whereby there was a teacher present and there was a classroom full of children. And the same day when the second incident happened, I went back home and I told my mother everything. And mind you, she was livid. She immediately called my father the same night, and my father was equally as livid, if not more. My mother actually asked my father to go to the school and talk to the principal, and that was actually arranged. I gave, you can say, an informal statement, but it was not written down, it was not documented at all. And the deputy principal called in the 2 offenders, and all they did was ask them to apologize. They simply said, apologize to this young girl and her father, because the father is actually threatening to inflict some violence or physical harm to them should the situation persist. They were just asked to apologize, and nothing was done at all.
Gender-based violence, a worldwide problem and everyday reality. It takes place in the street, on the bus, at home and at school. More than ever, gender-based violence has also infected our virtual spaces online and everywhere in all forms. The impact is crushing. Professor Helen Cahill, University of Melbourne.
So important to focus on gender-based violence prevention in schools for 2 reasons. One, it negatively impacts on participation in learning. The other thing, of course, is it affects people's well-being. So when people are the victims of violence in any form, they're more likely to suffer from mental health distress. But those who are involved in perpetrating violence are also vulnerable. So in the long term, people who engage in forms of violence as young people are much more likely to go on and repeat those patterns of violence in adulthood.
How can we measure the breadth and depth of this violence, especially when children and young people are the target? Maniela Ballier, Together for Girls.
The Violence Against Children and Youth Survey's findings reveal that an overwhelming number of boys and girls are victims of all forms of violence before age 18. And this happens in the child's immediate environment, at home, in school, and in the community. Approximately 3 out of 5 girls and 2 out of 3 boys experience any type of violence in childhood, whether physical, emotional, and sexual. Girls face particularly higher risk of sexual violence.
Often people think of violence as just physical acts, but when we're using this term, we're using it very broadly to include all forms of hurt and harm. So, for example, sexual violence, psychological or emotional violence. And this violence could take place face-to-face, or it could take place on social media. Once we understand that violence can take many forms, we're then ready to switch on our lens around the gendered nature of violence in schools. When we switch on our gender lens, we can see things like typically girls are victimised in certain ways, chiefly by boys, but not only by boys, and that boys are victimised in certain ways, almost always by boys. So we see patterns, and the patterns are gendered.
Gender-based violence is about power and gender relations which are at play everywhere. Baroness Sugg, Special Envoy for Girls' Education, UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office.
The gender lens is incredibly important. We know that gender is a key determiner of violence against both girls and boys. And we know that it affects the drivers and the experience and the impact of violence.
I would like for people who have children and other activists as well, and the general public, to actually put themselves in my shoes. I want them to think about if they had a child and they had to go through the emotional turmoil of being physically or verbally or emotionally violated in the school's premises, how would they actually want to enforce change?
At the root of gender-based violence, we find beliefs, attitudes and norms that perpetuate inequality and powerlessness. Basil Manuel, National Professional Teachers Organisation of South Africa.
Part of the problem being that there are attitudes, practices that are allowed, which in the eyes of the rest of the world is gender-based violence, but it has become almost institutionalized and accepted. It's become normed. If our schools aren't safe, our neighborhoods can never be safe.
This young girl of 8 or 9 years of age, she was stabbed by her jilted lover in broad daylight, and she survived 110 stitches. We took the case to the court of law, and we're still trying the case. The guy is out in bail. He's living his life. He's moved out of the city. And the girl still waits for justice. It's quite frustrating to know that even after years and years of advocacy, campaigning, influencing, lobbying, we do have the laws, but there are massive loopholes in implementation of these laws. And it's really sorry to kind of say this in 2020, that we do have such cases, like everyday cases. Just yesterday there was another case of a Dalit girl who was raped in UP.
Founder and Chief Executive of the Study Hall Foundation, Dr. Avashi Sani, talking about the same incident.
We were meeting yesterday, and I was meeting with my whole team, and we were all really feeling helpless, outraged, sickened, heartbroken, and helpless, because we've been working at gender equality through education for such a long time. And we were just wondering, does it make any difference? And we came to the conclusion that yes, it does. And how does it make a difference? One, it's of course a long-term way of working at gender-based violence. Girls actually accept this gender-based violence. It doesn't just happen on streets. It happens at home. They're not safe anywhere. They think it's part of being a girl, and that the best they can do is just save themselves in some way or just be invisible. Once they learn that they have a right to equal space in the world, whether it's at home, it's out in the street, it's in the workplace, it's in school, anywhere, to an equal, safe space, they begin demanding that. They begin equipping. It gives you a certain sense of confidence to fight back.
So we've got an opportunity when children are at school to set up the kinds of respectful relationships between the genders and within the genders that we really want to have persist into and through adulthood, so that these young people also become parents who are able to raise their own children in ways that teach respect for diversity and difference, and particularly respect across the genders.
Schools can play a significant role in addressing gender-based violence. Education International President Susan Hopgood.
Teachers are the ones that are in the classroom with the students every day. And we can take the lead in interrupting the gender norms that really do underpin gender-based violence. And we can do this through our classroom practices. And very, very importantly, we can do it through the curriculum itself. The most important starting point is finding a way to make teachers understand what gender-based violence is, not just in the abstract, but as an issue that they know because they've lived it themselves or because they've been close to someone who's experienced it. So therefore, a human-centred approach is key to supporting teachers to play an active role.
Schools can also be sanctuaries. They can be safe sanctuaries for girls in several ways. One, the whole culture of a school, which is non-violent, it should be non-violent, it should be caring, it should be safe. Secondly, the school becomes a support system for the girls, which can be extended to the families. So if they're in trouble, teachers can intervene. Our students feel that, they have the teachers' back. The teachers have their back. They have their teachers' support. And then the school accesses services of child protection services, of child welfare services, child helplines, of the police, which girls by themselves probably feel helpless and can't do. They get a voice, and that voice is amplified or supported by the voice of teachers in schools. The schools make it their business to make sure that girls are safe, not just in their schools, but at home as well and in the street as well.
How does gender-based violence pass from one generation to the next? How do boys learn to be violent? Dean Peacock Promondo.
So schools provide us with an incredible platform to address intergenerational cycles of violence. We know that by far the strongest predictor of a man's use of violence is his exposure to violence as a boy, particularly exposure to domestic violence in the home. And most young people walk around traumatized and confused by the violence that they see at home. They don't have anywhere to discuss it, to understand it, and to make sure that they heal from that violence. Schools are obviously, an ideal platform to provide mental health and psychosocial services to children exposed to violence. And unfortunately, in most countries around the world, there simply are not enough school counselors and school social workers.
Then, of course, there's the education of boys. We need boys to start looking at girls differently, thinking of them differently, and behaving differently, and treating them differently. So when you work with boys on this and you try to deconstruct toxic masculinities, you're also trying to get them to look at femininity differently, to look at women differently, not just as bodies, but as human beings, as persons, deserving equal respect. You need to educate boys out of this toxic masculinity, where one, they learn to think of women's bodies as just bodies, and women just as bodies and objects. And secondly, they grow up with a sense of entitlement to use these bodies the way they will, where consent doesn't figure. And so who is going to educate them out of this mindset? Education gives you a huge opportunity.
The work that I've done in schools with young men to address gender-based violence has inspired me. Young men I've met in schools across the world who are hungry for more meaningful relationships, who are supportive of gender equality, who want to see the girls in their lives do the best that they can.
Switching on a violence prevention lens, where do we start?
So there are lots of approaches that are effective in engaging men and boys in addressing gender-based violence in schools. What we know about those programs is that they are most effective when they're participatory, when they're experiential, when they allow young men and women to reflect on their own socialization, their own process of being socialized into gendered roles, and allow them to think about how well those gender roles work for them and what they'd like to change.
That is the reason why I actually decided to go into the advocacy that I'm doing with SRGBV, school-related gender-based violence. And that is one of the things that I truly focus on and use my story and actually think about the things that I would have liked in that point in time that could actually help myself at that point and all other girls and boys who may be facing the same situations or not worse.
Switching on the gender lens, along with the violence prevention lens and along with the vision for a fair and good world, is a really powerful starting point, but it's not enough. So as well as focusing on what we want to build, we have to have the skills to carry out our vision.
What skills do we need to prevent gender-based violence?
So the skills work in gender-based violence prevention education crosses over with what we call social and emotional learning. And it's where we explicitly grow the personal and social capabilities, such as being able to understand and manage our own and other people's emotional states, such as being able to express our needs and requests in respectful and assertive ways, rather than using aggression or submitting to undue horrible acts on the part of others. We're trying to grow social skills, and the way to grow social skills is to use them. And so children have to socially engage with each other in the learning activities. When they hear each other doing this work, they feel a sense of intimacy and connection to each other, and a very powerful form of recognition takes place. They recognise each other as human, not just as boy or girl, not just as dominant or rejected, not just as smart or not quite so smart in your scholarly work. And this is a very powerful thing to create in a classroom.
Critically important is making sure that you have a whole school approach, that the administrators, the teachers, the coaching staff are all on board and repeat the same messages, provide the same role modeling of gender equitable behavior.
Ending gender-based violence in schools needs to involve the whole school community. Lydia Mandera-Mpanze, Fawe, Zimbabwe.
When we look at a school, we should take it as a community. So the school is not the teachers and the learners themselves, but it includes even the non-teaching staff that are in the school. It includes the people that interact with the school in one way or the other. There is need for that comprehensive approach where we involve everyone who forms the school community. Whole school approaches, if we were to look at them, they are student-centered.
I actually want the students as well to also take the action themselves. If you see something, say something. Do not wait until the last resort, or do not wait until the worst happens to actually say something, because if another person is actually in distress and they do not find it comfortable to report the situation, then you can be of guidance and you can be of help to that person. So those are one of the things that I would actually want people out there and people looking at this right now, watching this, to actually think about and make cognizant decisions in actually wanting to enforce change.
The best way to end gender-based violence is to prevent it from happening in the first place. We all have a role to play.
It is true that the COVID-19 lockdown has both exacerbated violence against girls, adolescents, and women, and shed light on the silent pandemic of gender-based violence. We can make a difference to prevent and reduce violence. We must all take timely actions. All of us, political leaders, policymakers, parents, teachers, community members, children themselves can take action to end violence against children and youth.
Everyone watching this, I would request you, I would plead you that even if you can make one tiny effort of ensuring that a young girl in your house should feel safe, and what steps you can take to make her feel safe in the house, that is it. That is all that is required. If every one of us is responsible and accountable for our actions, that's all that we need to influence change. And all of these changes kind of accumulate and make big policy changes. So all of the changes that we want, or the changes that we really aspire to make a gender just society, or to create safe spaces for everyone, it starts from you and yourself, and you need to make the change.